Hey everybody, welcome back to the shop. This is Todd with Industrial Comfort. In today's video, I'm going to show you how to make this beautiful shaker style handmade stool with some walnut wedge joints. Let's get started. I'm starting this project with an extra slab of elm that I have here in the workshop. I just took it off the flattening jig and I've got 1.75 inches of thickness. I've got 29 inches in length and about 20 inches in width, which should be more than enough for the stool. Now, because it's 1.75 inches thick, I've set the saw here to the same 1.75 inches so that when we rip this wood, we get nice square stock for the legs. Now, I'm going to start cutting the legs until I get to the center. Then I'm going to move to 12 inches for the seat. And then if I haven't cut enough legs, I'll move on to continue to cut the legs. And the reason I'm doing it this way is that there's much more color variation out toward the edges where the bark begins. As you move further into the heartwood, you get much more consistency in both color and grain structure. And I really want that consistency for the seat of the stool. So that's why I'm going to cut it in that particular order. So the saw is set. Let's start cutting, and then we'll move on to the next step where we try to figure out where we're going to drill these holes and at what angle. I decided to go 18 inches wide on the stool seat by the 12 inches that we cut a minute ago. So I'm over here at the miter saw. I'm just going to give this a quick cut. Now I'm going to use my tape and my speed square to draw a line 3.5 inches in. Now there's no scientific process here, but 3.5 inches just feels about right in terms of where I'm going to drill the holes for this seat. I'm going to take it 2.5, so I'll remove 1 inch when we come in from the edges here on the long side. The next step is to find the angle at which we're going to drill the holes for the legs. So I have some blue painter's tape out here on the table, and this is just to give me a rough guide of the height of the stool in relation to this workbench here. I've got a level that I've used a speed square to square up to make sure that we've got a straight angle. And based on the lines that I've drawn here, I'm going to loosely bring these legs to what looks like center. And you have to make sure that the legs extend beyond the edge of the seat. Otherwise, you're going to have a really unstable stool. So I'm thinking about 3 inches feels about right. So we'll kind of move that to about 3. And then we'll shift this leg over to intersect the level. And then what I'm going to do is get my angle gauge. And we'll measure the angle here. And this is looking like it's about, let me see, about 11 or 12 degrees, which when I did a quick Google search or on ChatGPT or whatever, that's more or less what they said a standard angle is. So that's what I'm going to go with. So we'll move on to the next step and we'll start drilling these holes out. Now before we get to the drilling, I want to show you what I've done here. So you can see that I've punched the holes
at the location where I'm going to do the drilling. Now this is 2.5 inches up by 3.5 inches in. I've also drawn a line that goes from the corner straight into the punch hole. The reason that I'm doing that is because I want the rake of the stool leg to be both laterally in this direction and then laterally on this axis as well. And so the hole that I want to drill at 11 degrees, I want to come in this way. And so this is going to help me orient on the drill press the direction in which I lay the board. And I'll show you that right now. So I have the table on the drill press angled at 11 degrees, and I've removed this center plate to account for the angle so that when we go through the piece of wood, we're not chewing up the table here. Now I put a piece of painter's tape across the table, and I've marked the center line where the drill bit is going to intersect this 90-degree angle. Now what I'm going to do is use some double-sided tape, and I've got a piece of scrap board to prevent any blowout or tear out on the underside of the seat that we're about to drill out. And what I'm going to do is line up this line, which corresponds to the end-to-end line on my seat, and then I'm going to just line it up with the line here so that we have sort of a template that we can use to drill the appropriate angle. Now I wish I could tell you there was an easy way to get this thing clamped up onto the drill press here, but in the end I didn't want to, I was wasting too much time making a jig. So I drew a line from corner to corner. As I mentioned in the previous step, I drew a line down the midpoint of the table that intersects with the drill bit, and I just did the best I could to line it up by just by eyeballing it. So hopefully everything will work out. So we'll get these things drilled out. Now before I put these legs on the lathe, I'm going to measure out the location in which I'm going to drill the holes that the cross members are going to sit in. So aesthetically, I'm going to go about 1/3 of the way up the leg, which is approximately 9 inches. So I'll mark this out. I'll use my speed square to mark the line here. Actually, can't see. Okay, now this is 1 3/4 inches, so the midpoint is going to be 7/8. So I'll put my calipers here just so I can mark the point at which I'm going to drill the hole. I'll do that for the remaining 3 legs, and then we'll take it over to the drill press, which is already set at that 11 degrees. So we'll drill these to the midpoint and then get it over to the lathe. Now thankfully these holes are going to be significantly easier to drill. So just make sure you obviously have your legs oriented in the right direction, or otherwise your angles are going to be incorrect when you put the legs together. So what I'm going to do is just center the drill bit in the hole here, and I'm going to lower it down, and then I'm just going to use a speed square to make sure that it's perpendicular to this base. I'm going to clamp it in place and we'll drill the hole. And we're good to go. I've also set the depth stop, so we just drill down and it'll bottom out when it reaches the stop. Now for this hole, I'm using a 3/4 inch bit. And again, it's entirely up to you as to what size you use for your mortise and tenons. Now before I finish up with the legs, I'm going to add a little bit of contour to this seat. So I've set the table saw at 30 degrees and I've backed the fence off to 1 1/4 inches. And I'm just going to run this through, and it'll just take a nice chamfered edge off the perimeter of the seat. With the leg now attached to the lathe, I don't know if you can see this in the camera, but I've etched a line 2.5 inches from the end here. Now, what I'm going to do is carve out a tenon, and I need at least 2.5 inches at that 1.25 inch diameter in order to fit into the base of the seat. So we'll do that, and then before I round this over, we're going to take it over to the table saw, and I'm going to show you guys how to make a slot in the tenon so that we can create that wedge joint a little bit later on. We've got the block, we got it cut and drilled. Now we're gonna leave the fence as is, and I've got the reason that I didn't round these legs over yet is because I want to make sure that the slots that we cut in these tenons for the wedge joint are all going to be unidirectional. And so I want to line up all of these legs going the same direction. So I'm going to push the tenon into this little jig. And I've got a piece of wood to orient against the fence. And I'm just going to turn the saw on and we're going to run this through. And there we go. Now, I am not a physicist, but I know that when creating wedge joints like this, you need to drill a hole larger than the width of this slot in order to relieve pressure or stress to prevent the wood from cracking once you insert the wedge. So I've got the width of this is an 1/8 inch, which matches the kerf of the blade, and I've got a 3/8 inch bit in here, a Forstner bit that I'm just going to make the holes with. Off camera, I decided to drill another hole before I start rounding this over to create the cross brace between these legs. And then I drew a line 8.5 inches down just to make sure that we've got an even point at which we're going to round over the bottom of this leg. Now, if I had been a little more thoughtful, I probably would have waited to cut the channel. I'm not in love with how this is attached to this chuck here, but I think it'll be fine. So I'm going to start to round this over, and we'll move on to the next step.
The legs are now in place for a test fit, and I'm going to take some measurements of the distance between the legs so that I can then move on to turn the cross members. So if you remember, I drilled about half the diameter of these posts, or these legs, so I'm going to just measure these out. This one works out to 10 inches, and then this one works out to about 15, and I'm going to go 15 3/4. So we'll put some stock in the lathe, and I'm going to turn these smaller ones first. Okay, so final measurements on the larger cross members were 16 inches. So I've got a piece of 1 1/4 by 1 1/4 stock here. I've got to go down to 3/4 of an inch to fit into the mortise, and then I'll probably stick with the inch in diameter for this midsection before getting down to 1/4 inch. Now, because I'm not satisfied with just a flat top to the seat of this stool, I've developed a system where I've created a pencil with a pendulum, and I'm going to use this to develop an arc so that I can trace where I'm going to cut on the bandsaw. Now, this was purely trial and error, but what I did was I measured out the distance that the string is from the edge. I measured the center point on the seat here to the same mark where the string is, and then again, purely by trial and error, I kind of came up with an arc that I thought would work, and there we go. So I'll bring this over to the bandsaw and we'll cut it out. Now, for stability, I've mounted a 4x4 on the back with some double-sided tape. I shouldn't have cut the chamfer in first because it's compromising the stability, but we're going to give this a go. Worst comes to worst, I can clean it up with a belt sander. This is definitely high risk, and I certainly don't want to ruin the project, but I also don't think it looks great. So let's give it a go. Okay, I've got all the pieces laid out. Now it's just time to glue everything up and assemble the stool. So I'm going to start with the kind of these smaller cross members. This thing has had time to set up overnight, so now it's time to knock off these extra nubs on top from the wedge joints. Now in the previous step, what I forgot to mention was the wedge itself, which I've just taken an extra piece of walnut that I had in the shop, cut 4 little pieces out. These are about an 1/8 inch thick, and then what I did was I used a sander to just taper them down a little bit, and then I hammered them in place. So I've got a flush cut saw that I've never used before that I thought would be a really good tool to get these nubs off. The problem is the teeth on this thing are so small that it's going to take me hours to get through this stuff. So instead what I'm going to use is one of these multi-tools. This is going to allow me to get through this material literally in no time, and then I'm going to take my sander and smooth everything out. And here's our stool, ready for the finish of your choice. I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, please give me a thumbs up and subscribe. Thanks for watching.